History often paints the sinking of the Titanic as an inevitable accident. But the documented reality reveals something far more disturbing. The ship did not go down because there were no warnings. It received direct messages, precise coordinates, repeated alerts from ships already surrounded by ice. And still the steel giant kept its speed. Caution was pushed aside in the name of the era's technical arrogance. The question we need to answer today is not only how the ship sank, it is why, with so many red lights flashing, no one had the courage to stop the engines. If you want to understand the hidden story behind this negligence, and how overconfidence sealed the fate of thousands of people, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. What we are about to reveal changes the way we understand what really happened on that tragic night. On the night of April 14, 1912, Titanic had already been crossing the icy waters of the North Atlantic for 4 days, moving with an elegance that concealed the raw power of her engines. On board, the mood was one of absolute calm, a sense of safety that only the largest and most luxurious ship in the world could give its passengers. That night, the sea was unusually still, so calm that even the most experienced sailors would have called it a sea of glass, a flat mirror-like surface reflecting the stars with almost hypnotic clarity. The sky was clear. The air was sharp and cold. But for anyone watching the horizon from the deck, everything seemed perfect, almost poetic. And maybe you have heard this before. In moments of great crisis, it is often the appearance of perfection that hides the greatest danger. On the bridge, the officers followed their routine with unshakable confidence. They believed the technology behind those 4 towering funnels and the steel of the hull beneath them could overcome any natural obstacle. But that calm was actually an invisible trap. With no waves, the water did not break against the base of nearby icebergs. That meant the lookouts could not see the one visual clue that might have saved the ship. And without binoculars, which were unavailable in the crow's nest because of a logistical mistake, the crew relied only on the naked eye to spot danger in a route known to be filled with ice at that time of year. As the ship maintained her cruising speed of 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, a series of invisible messages cut through the airwaves. They came through the radio antennas. They carried warnings that could have changed the course of history. Today we are going deep into the records of that night to examine each warning that arrived, one by one, and understand why the most critical information never reached the hands of those with the power to change the ship's fate. We will see how the radio room, overwhelmed with social messages from wealthy passengers, became a deadly bottleneck for navigation safety. If you value this kind of detailed investigation, take a moment to subscribe and follow every detail with us. From this point on, we leave the legends behind and focus on the facts, the bridge and the chain of decisions that turned a luxury voyage into one of mankind's greatest tragedies. After all, why would a giant so well prepared choose to ignore the voice of the ocean? That is what we are about to discover. It is common to imagine Titanic as a lonely giant, a single light in the black vastness of the North Atlantic. But the reality of 1912 was very different. Back then, the ocean was like a busy highway, a living commercial route where dozens of ships crossed paths every day, carrying valuable cargo and thousands of immigrants searching for a new life. Titanic, with her 4 massive funnels pouring smoke into the star-filled sky, was only the crown jewel of a crowded sea lane. But what many people do not realize is that this constant traffic created an invisible and frantic communication network. Through the radio technology of the time, the ship was in regular contact with other vessels sailing hundreds of miles away. Have you ever been driving on a busy road when every driver ahead starts flashing their headlights to warn you about an accident up ahead? That is exactly what was happening over the radio waves during that fateful week in April. Inside that steel structure, in a small room known as the Marconi room, the constant sound of electric sparks and Morse code clicks formed the heartbeat of a ship that never slept. There, the wireless operators worked exhausting shifts. They were the ears of that floating city. But here is a technical detail that is often forgotten. These men were not direct employees of the shipping company. They worked for the Marconi company. That created a strange dynamic. The priority was not always navigation. Often it was the profit generated by private messages. Imagine the pressure on those young men. They had to handle stacks of telegrams from first-class passengers who wanted to notify their families about arrival times, or simply show off the luxury of the voyage. At the same time, technical messages from other ships were trying to find space on those crowded frequencies. The ships sailing ahead of Titanic, including cargo vessels and rival ocean liners, were not merely passing through. They were monitoring the conditions of a winter that had been unusually mild. That mild weather had caused an abnormal amount of ice to break loose from the glaciers of Greenland. This information was circulating freely. The sea of glass we described earlier made the journey look smooth. But the warnings reaching the operator's headphones were clear. Ice was drifting farther south, faster and in greater volume than seasonal maps had predicted. There was a constant exchange, a maritime dialogue. One cargo ship reported the position of an ice field. Titanic responded with a routine acknowledgement. It was technical, almost bureaucratic, and it did not seem to carry the weight of a tragedy that was already approaching. What becomes truly frustrating when we analyze the ship's records is realizing that the crew, from junior officers to the senior command on the bridge, fully understood that the region ahead was not clear. They knew, through geographic coordinates that we can still trace with precision today, that ice lay directly ahead. There was no element of surprise the way many dramatic retellings suggest. They were not sailing blindly without information. They were sailing with a mental map being drawn in real time by the radio messages of other captains. But the problem with being the largest and safest is that confidence becomes a dangerous filter. When you command 46,000 tons of steel, you begin to believe the sea should adapt to you, not the other way around. That active communication network should have been Titanic's shield. Instead, it became background noise. With every passing hour, the ship moved closer to an invisible barrier of ice that had already been sighted and reported by at least 5 other vessels in the previous 12 hours. The warnings were there, floating in the air, waiting for someone with authority to see them not as statistical data, but as life or death sentences. As the sun set that Sunday, April 14th, the atmosphere inside Titanic was one of absolute sophistication. Dining rooms were filled with lively conversation. But while the elite of the era enjoyed lavish meals, the reality outside the steel hull was changing silently and dangerously. The first serious warnings about ice fields did not arrive as a sudden surprise in the middle of the night. They began earlier that morning in a routine tone, as if they were ordinary weather bulletins no one expected to dictate the final fate of the voyage. Have you ever received an important warning, then set it aside because you believed everything was under control? That was exactly the mood that settled over the command posts. The first relevant warning came early, around 9 in the morning, from a vessel sailing several miles ahead. The telegram was clear. There were icebergs and large ice fields in a position Titanic would reach within hours. Following protocol, the wireless operator sent the message to the bridge, where the captain received it. But this is where the psychology of the unsinkable begins to reveal its cracks. Instead of issuing an immediate order to reduce speed or alter course as a precaution, command treated the information like a geographic curiosity. The warning was placed on a notice board, almost like a reminder that the scenery outside was changing. But it created no real sense of urgency. After all, why should a ship of that magnitude worry about pieces of ice that smaller vessels were already steering around? The great problem is that blind faith in the technology of the time created a kind of intellectual blind spot. The navigation officers believed that if any real danger appeared, the lookouts high in the mast would see it in time for an evasive maneuver. But remember one crucial detail: the sea was terrifyingly calm. That same sea of glass. Under normal conditions, the ocean breaks against the base of an iceberg, creating white foam. Without waves, the ice becomes a silent black shadow. And to make matters worse, the absence of binoculars in the lookout station meant the men were depending entirely on the naked eye. Meanwhile, inside the radio room, the workload only increased. The wireless operators were exhausted, handling equipment that was temperamental and loud. As the day moved on, more warnings arrived. But during those hours, the priority was not navigation safety. It was sending personal telegrams from first-class passengers. Safety messages were often stacked and delivered to officers in batches, losing the immediacy the situation demanded. As the night advanced and Titanic moved deeper into near-total darkness, the temperature on the outer decks dropped to freezing levels. The ice warnings changed tone. They now described massive walls of ice blocking the commercial routes. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you realize you are moving too fast on an unfamiliar road with no lights? That was the ship's technical situation. But on the bridge, the urgency of those messages seemed to disappear inside the comfort of command. By mid-afternoon, a message from another ocean liner was delivered directly into the hands of senior command. It was not vague. It gave exact coordinates of large icebergs directly in Titanic's path. And yet, in an act of carelessness that still puzzles historians, that information was placed in a pocket and shared with other officers only hours later. There is a vast difference between knowing danger exists and understanding that it is directly ahead. Titanic seemed trapped in that gap of perception. The speed remained steady at 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour. The four funnels continued to pour smoke into the night, driving the giant toward the center of an ice field other ships had already chosen not to cross. Meanwhile, in the Marconi room, the atmosphere was pure technical chaos. The wireless operators were dealing with a huge backlog of passenger messages, and the frequency was crowded. To those operators, each ice warning became just another piece of paper to process in the middle of a pile of hotel reservations and personal requests. The critical information was physically there, written on paper, but the bridge and the radio room seemed to be speaking different languages. Before we move on to the warning that could have changed everything, you need to understand one thing. What is about to happen in the next few minutes of our video is the historical turning point that sealed the fate of more than 1,000 souls. If you have made it this far, it is because you value the truth behind the facts. So stay with me. Because what we are about to reveal about the next warning is what truly separates an accident from pure negligence. Around 9:40 p.m. that night, Titanic received what historians often call the definitive warning. It was a technical telegram, precise, sent by a cargo ship sailing just ahead. This warning mapped a massive ice barrier, stretching for miles, located exactly in the coordinates toward which Titanic's bow was pointing. If that message had reached the captain's hands at that exact moment, the only logical decision would have been to stop the engines. But instead of saving the ship, that piece of paper was buried beneath a pile of passenger telegrams. The wireless operator on duty was at the limit of his endurance. The sound of electric sparks was deafening. When the warning from that cargo ship arrived, it did not carry the highest urgency prefix. To the exhausted young man, it was just another technical detail. While the warning sat in silence, Titanic continued her relentless march at 22 knots. The four towering funnels roared against the black sky. On the bridge, the first officer watched the horizon with a frightening calm. Without binoculars in the lookout posts, the men high in the mast were almost blind. They were trying to spot a black object in a black sea. The tension reached a critical level when another ship, much closer, tried to warn that it was surrounded by ice and had stopped its engines. The response that came from Titanic was a technical outburst. "Shut up, I am busy." That nearby ship, rudely silenced, turned off its wireless and went to sleep. At that moment, the last voice that might have saved Titanic went silent. This chain of errors was not just an individual failure. It was the collapse of a culture built on overconfidence. Titanic was no longer merely taking risks. She was already inside the ice field. Time does not stop, and the ship kept moving forward, ignoring the silent screams coming through the radio waves. In the final hours before the impact, Titanic seemed to float in a universe of its own. The clock had just passed 10 at night, and life inside the steel giant was beginning to slow down. In the North Atlantic that night, the silence was complete. There was no wind, no waves, no moon. The sea was so still it looked like polished metal. On the bridge, the routine continued with almost military precision, but it was stained by a dangerous lack of urgency. The first officer held the course with a confidence that bordered on technical arrogance. They knew about the ice warnings. The messages were there. But the decision to maintain full speed was never questioned. They believed any obstacle would be spotted miles away. High above, the lookouts faced the cutting cold with bare eyes against the wind. Without the binoculars, still locked away in a cabinet, those men were at a deadly disadvantage. They stared into the darkness, searching for any sign of white water, the foam that forms when waves hit something solid. But the sea was a perfect mirror. The iceberg in their path was what sailors sometimes call a blue iceberg. A dark mass of ice that absorbs the faint light of the stars. As the ship pushed forward, the four funnels continued to throw sparks into the night. In the radio room, silence now ruled. Because the operator on the nearby ship had turned off his equipment, no one slowed down. No one changed the protocol. Overconfidence had created tunnel vision, where only the final destination seemed to matter. It is fascinating and terrifying to realize that until the final seconds, Titanic's fate could have been different if just one of those radio messages had been taken seriously.
Something's there.
But the momentum of 46,000 tons moving at 22 knots is not something easily stopped. It was exactly 11:40 p.m. when the illusion of safety shattered. High in the mast, the lookouts finally saw what the radio messages had been warning about all day. At first, it was only a shape, a darker hole in the darkness of the horizon. Three quick strikes on the warning bell. Then the desperate cry, "Iceberg right ahead!" On the bridge, the first officer reacted quickly. Hard to port, engines full astern. But physics is a law that does not negotiate. Titanic began to turn. Her massive bow started to move away, but the danger was below the surface. The impact was not a thunderous head-on crash. It was a long, continuous scrape along the side, below the waterline. While many passengers felt only a slight vibration, in the lower compartments the sound was death. The ice acted like a giant can opener, tearing through the steel hull and opening a series of wounds that allowed the freezing ocean to pour into the ship. In that moment, the technical pride behind the idea that the ship was unsinkable collapsed. The iceberg had damaged the exact number of compartments Titanic could not afford to lose. The ice no one had taken seriously was now in command of the ship. What remained of Titanic that morning was not only a trail of destruction, it was the collapse of an age of certainty. The ship did not sink because of a technical failure no one could have predicted. It sank because of a chain of human decisions that placed schedule above caution. The giant's final agony was a spectacle of physics and horror, with the bow sinking deeper and deeper. Flooded by the waters from that long scrape along the hull, the ship's structure began to fail. The four funnels tilted at impossible angles as the sea swallowed the deck. and then Titanic broke in two. First, the bow began its journey to the bottom. Then the stern was pulled by gravity toward its eternal resting place. This story leaves us with a lesson. Overconfidence is the ground where the greatest tragedies take root. Often in our own lives, we receive warnings about the icebergs ahead, but we choose to maintain full speed. 114 years later, Titanic still teaches us that humility before forces we cannot control is our only true safety net. If this investigation made sense to you, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from, because understanding the past is the only way to avoid repeating the same mistakes in the future.